All right, I am sure that you have heard people talk about mortgage pre-approval. Sometimes I bet it sounds like a sales tactic for realtors to try to get you to sign a contract or to agree to work with them. Today, I want to talk about what mortgage pre-approval is. I want to talk about why it's important and why it's something that I have all of my buyers do before we start the process, okay? Mortgage pre-approval, simply put, is how you know how much of a home you can afford or not. So it's the first and most important step on the home buying journey. And the reason is that people will get their expectations all out of whack without a mortgage pre-approval. Now, there are other terms out there like mortgage pre-qualification. There are terms out there there are things out there where people say, you don't need to get pre-approved, if you're just looking or whatever. My opinion is this. If you are serious about buying a home, you need to be serious about knowing what that home is going to cost you. So, the best way to do that is to get pre-approved for a mortgage. Now, you can have lots of conversations with a lender, and my best lenders in town do this without a commitment, without signing any paperwork, without a credit pull, without an application being filled out. You can get very far down the road of having a conversation in order to know exactly or close to it what you may be paying based on your credit score, based on the amount of funds that you have, based on what you're comfortable paying for your budget. And you'll also figure out how much of a house you can afford in terms of a total dollar volume amount. People often, very often, totally misunderstand what they can and can't afford. So it's important that we get you nailed in on that number before we start looking at properties. Because from my perspective, what happens is if you're not nailed down on your perspective, then you will be one of those people who looks at 100 properties and can't find the one that you want because in reality, you should be looking a lot higher, but you don't know that. Or you're going to be the person who feels like, man, I'm looking at all of these properties and they're amazing and I want them so much. And then when we actually go to look at them, you can't afford them. That's a problem. That's why it's important for you to get pre-approved for your mortgage, okay? It is kind of seen as the first step for all buyers because you need to be pre-approved if you're going to be taken seriously, okay? When we look at higher end homes or really any homes, we do have to be able to provide proof that you can purchase the property. It's not always requested. Sometimes agents don't ask for that, but the reality is you need to be able to provide that as a real estate agent. And so that's why I take that very seriously. I don't take any buyers to show houses to them without a mortgage pre-approval or at least without being very deep in the process of pre-approval. So you better have had conversations with a lender. You better have an idea of how much money you have to put down and your closing costs and what they're going to be, of what your price range is going to be, what you can budget for your monthly payment. All of those things are very important, okay? If you don't do that, then we run into all kinds of other issues. So there's all kinds of things that can go wrong if you don't have a mortgage pre-approval. I already talked about a couple of them, but let's just talk about from a negotiation and multiple offer situation, although we're not really in that right now. One of the things that happens in those scenarios is that you go into a multiple offer situation. Let's say I have the buyer who hasn't been pre-approved. Well, then I'm at a disadvantage from a negotiation standpoint because let's say that there's 4 other offers on the table and they are all verified offers. Either they have a pre-approval for a mortgage or they have some kind of proof of funds for a cash purchase. Meanwhile, I'm sitting here and I have a client that doesn't have any proof that they can afford to buy the house that they are offering to buy. And that does not look good to a seller and to a listing agent. So it's important for that reason that you have a pre-approval letter. Now, there are some differences between pre-approval and pre-qualification, and those are terms that you will hear a lot, and I want to talk about that for a second. A pre-approval is more guaranteed. A pre-approval will require a credit check, a pre-approval will be a more thorough investigation of your eligibility to qualify for a loan. A pre-qualification letter oftentimes is not as thorough. People that do pre-qualification letters often do not look as deeply, and they don't look with as much of a fine-tooth comb holding up a buyer's eligibility and what they can provide against the requirements for the loan program. So it's important that we work with lenders that actually offer pre-approval letters and not just pre-qualification letters. Okay, that's something that we run into a lot, especially when we deal with large national brands. Often those places don't provide the same level of quality of pre-approval as some of the smaller, more local places do. Another benefit to that, to working with smaller places, is that they know the ins and outs of your local market and what the offerings are in their industry here in our city. So places that are large, that go across the nation and aren't based out of the city, don't have a location physically in the city that you're in, often you run into issues where they just don't know what's up. So those are some of the differences between pre-qualification and pre-approval. Now, I will say that pre-approval is the first and most important step, but it's not the only step. Okay, you need to have a few other things underway that are outside of the scope of the pre-approval per se. So the main one that I want to touch on here is you need to have a really good budget. I talk about this a lot, and I'm not a financial planner. I'm not your accountant. I don't want to get too much in your business, but I always say this to everybody. If you're buying a house, you need to have a plan for exactly how much you can afford. Because one of the things that I really don't want to happen to you, that does happen to clients, unfortunately, is that budgets change or people don't have budgets and expenses change. And then people find themselves in a situation where they can't afford to pay for what they've just purchased anymore. And so that puts them either in a really uncomfortable position where they're having to work a lot more than they otherwise would, or it puts them in a situation where they're going to have to sell their house and maybe earlier than they would like to, or something like that. So beyond mortgage pre-approval, I would say the first and most important step is actually just getting your house in order, getting your budget under control, figuring out what you're going to do with the money that you already have before we figure out how much of a house you can afford, how much money you can put down, how much you're going to need for closing costs, all that kind of stuff. But mortgage pre-approval is very, very important. It's one of the most important things that you can acquire. It's the first step on the journey. And I would definitely recommend that way prior to the time that you are ready to actually make your purchase, you go ahead and start having conversations with a lender, particularly, I would say, with a lender who's willing to work with you, a lender who's willing to have a conversation and who's willing to guide you through the process without you necessarily having to apply up front. Another thing I would definitely say is if you run into a lender that charges a loan application fee that's non-refundable, I would stay away from them. I've run into that a few times in my career, and it's never been a good situation. So I have heard of some people that charge those that are legit. I think there's almost always better local offerings that don't charge a loan application fee. Those are the people that you should work with, okay? None of the folks that I work with charge a loan application fee. And if they do, then I'm going to have a conversation with them about continuing our relationship, because that's not something that I think that you should pay. So that's my take on mortgage pre-approval. This has not been a super long episode of the podcast, but it's a small piece, but a very important piece. So it's important that we have this conversation. I hope you're a little bit more equipped on the topic, and I'll see you on the next one.